Morning, church. My name is Josh. I'm the lead pastor here. If I haven't met you yet, I would love to get the opportunity to meet you. Thanks for joining us for another week of our Life Together teaching series. This series is all about interpersonal relationships. We kind of started the year with a teaching series on prayer that really focuses on our relationship with God. And so this teaching series is really focusing on our relationships with one another, the kind of community that God has called us to live. And we really started off with the foundational principle from Jesus that we should seek to live lives where we love your neighbor as yourself, right? And even if you're here and you're not yet a follower of Jesus, we hope that this teaching series will still be useful to you and helpful to you in your relationships in your life. We believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And that means that he knows the proper way for us to live our lives in relationship as well. And so we hope that you find today especially helpful. The topic we're covering today is communication, one of the most important factors of every single relationship we have in our lives is communication. A few years ago, there was a story about a Starbucks in Virginia that found its way into headlines across the country. And the story goes like this. There was a new barista named Crystal. You should see a picture of them on the screen. And Crystal had just been working at this Starbucks for a short amount of time when she noticed that one of the regular customers that visited that Starbucks was a guy named Ibby. And Ibby is deaf, no hearing aids or anything, so he has to use sign language. And she noticed that he was having some difficulty getting his order across. And this really struck a chord with her when she bumped into him outside of work, actually. They were in line at the same pizza shop one day. And Ibby was trying to order pizza from this guy at the counter at the pizza shop. And it was just a communication breakdown. The guy was frustrated because he couldn't get the order. Ibby was visibly frustrated. And it was this moment where she got to kind of see this interaction that caused her to go home and have this feeling, I need to do something about this. So she hopped on YouTube. She watched a few hours of, kind of the introductory American Sign Language. So the next time that Ibby came in, she was able to do some preliminary signing to him, what's your coffee order? And she brought him this note. There's a picture of the note that she actually wrote him. It just says, I've been learning American Sign Language so that you can have the same customer experience as everybody else. And she didn't think anything of it. She thought this was just kind of a normal thing that you would do as a Starbucks employee. But Ibby posted a photo that he took of this little note that he was given and just said, this is why I love Starbucks, Starbucks. And that photo, within a matter of days, was a trending photo. It went viral, and local news channels were contacting Crystal and Ibby to try and get their story. And in every article that I read about this story, and I even watched a little clip from a local news channel, what struck me about it was, one, the profound impact that such a small act had on Ibby, who is deaf. And what this really goes to show us is that communication is about more than just what coffee shows up in your cup. That communication actually has a ton to do with relationships. And he felt very isolated, and for most of his life has felt isolated being deaf, not being able to really communicate with other people. And a simple act of someone speaking his language, American Sign Language, actually invited him into that person's world and invited him into really relationship. But what also struck me about this is whenever an interviewer would ask Crystal, why did you do this? This is such a crazy thing. She didn't view it as such a crazy thing. She kind of viewed it as, wouldn't the ordinary Starbucks employee do this? And the answer is no. That's why everyone, shared this story and it went viral, is because it's so out of the ordinary. And yet the reality is that Starbucks barista put more work into communicating with a customer than many of us do in the communications that we do in our lives. That communication breakdowns happen all the time. Think about the people that you work with. Think about your family members and your friends. And it's hard to emphasize enough the high stakes that we're talking about when we're talking about communication. Communication breakdowns result in marriages crumbling. Communication breakdowns are at the heart of people quitting their jobs, or sometimes people getting fired from their jobs. Communication breakdowns result in people leaving one church to go to another, or leaving one life group to go to another, or sometimes even walking away from God for a period of their life as well. There are parents who haven't spoken to their kids in years, let alone decades, because communication has broken down. And so, as simple as this topic might sound, it is of the utmost importance for you and I, as followers of Jesus, to get communication right. So to start off, here's some framework around communication. I believe there's two main kinds of communication that we take part in. Number one is transactional communication. That's what kind of coffee would you like? And, Crystal, you can imagine her learning the sign for caramel macchiato or whatever, Transactional communication, it's transferring information. And we do this. This is really the fabric of society is built on this kind of communication. Trading goods and services, communicating information. You would say something like, hey, do we need to pick up anything from the grocery store? That's a transactional communication. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, by and large, mostly surface level. The deeper kind of communication is what I'm going to call relational communication, and that's where you're knowing and being known by another person. These are the kinds of things like, tell me about your hopes and your dreams for the future, or what's going on in your life right now that's causing you fear or anxiety, or what are you feeling, or just how are you doing really? Those are kinds of relational styles of communication. When you ask someone, what's a way I can pray for you right now, usually that starts getting at the heart of those relational forms of communication. And these are both important, and the skills and things we're going to look at today should help us in both of these kinds of communication. But often what I've found is if your communication is breaking down at the transactional level, you're not able to even talk about simple things like, where do you want to eat for lunch after church today? Then often there's a breakdown at the relational level as well that it stems from. Not always, but often. David Augsburger says this about communication. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. I'll say it again because this is really important for us today. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. Jesus taught us to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think it's so true for us that we would say very few people are actually hearing us, or maybe we're hearing from very few people at those deep relational levels. And so part of loving your neighbor well is hearing them. Our main text for today comes from James chapter 1, and there's going to be a lot of kind of smaller passages. We're going to go today is more of a true topical sermon, so feel free to jot down some notes and some of these Bible references and go back and read them later. But James chapter 1, verse 19 is this really kind of foundational passage when it comes to communication. James writes to the church, he says this, "Know this, my beloved brothers," and we could say, and sisters, "let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." A few summers ago, I taught through James's letter to the church. If you were here, maybe you remember that, or maybe you're familiar with the background context of James, but James is writing to the persecuted church. He's actually just gotten done talking about consider it joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter trials of various kinds. Now, joy isn't the first feeling we have when it comes to suffering, is it? So these are Christians who are suffering. They're going through trials. And instead of joy, often our first response when we're going through something hard is anger. And so this is like an angry church that James is writing this to. And he's saying that the anger that we have, the wrath or the unforgiveness or the bitterness that we're holding onto in our hearts, that's actually a barrier preventing us from what he calls the righteousness of God, basically living the life that God has called you to live. And so he's saying one of the first places that comes out, that it's evident that you have that bitterness or that anger in your heart, is through what you say. It's through your communication. Jesus said the same thing. We looked at this last week. Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so for us, we need to take this principle very seriously. James is writing this to a persecuted church. How much more so is this true for us in our lives? If even someone who's suffering, he's saying, now let go of that anger. He's not saying that all anger is wrong. There's a holy anger, a righteous anger. But he's saying be slow to be angry. And then these two principles for us in communication. Be quick to what? Listen or hear. And be slow to speak. Be quick to hear and slow to speak. Not never speak. Not that there's never a time to speak, but we need to be slow in when we speak. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book Life Together, talks about this. Here's a lengthy quote from him, but it's from his book Life Together. I think there's some gold for us in these words. He talks about the ministry of listening. He says this: the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them. Just as love to God begins with listening to his word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is listening to them. It is God's love for us that he not only gives us his word, but also lends us his ear. I love that phrase. He lends us his ear. So it is his work that we do for our brother when we learn to listen to him. Christians, especially ministers, so he's like targeting me right here. He's like, especially your pastor. They often think that they must always contribute something when they are in the company of others, that this is the one service they have to render. They forget that listening can be a greater service than speaking. Many people are looking for an ear that will listen. They do not find it among Christians because these Christians are talking when they should be listening. And so here's our main point for today. I think James is saying this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is saying this. Here's just the concise version of our main point for today. Focus more on hearing than being heard. Focus more on hearing the other person, or we could say loving the other person by listening to them, than being heard yourself. Now, this isn't to say that the Bible doesn't have anything to say about what you talk about. James goes on in James chapter 3 to talk about the power of speech. We need to be really careful of what we say. I think the overarching principle for that is Ephesians 4:29. You can look that up later. But basically what Paul writes to the church, he says, "Let no unwholesome speech come out of your mouth, only that which builds up so that it might give grace to those who hear." And so it is important what we say, but today, I think for us, the primary reason why communication is breaking down is we're paying more attention to what we're saying than listening to others. That we don't need help with what to say. We're saying plenty as it is. In fact, sometimes we'll be talking to someone, and as we're listening to them, we're almost half listening to them because we're formulating our response, or we'll cut them off and say, no, I know where you're going with this, or just let me interrupt you, right? Even just because you say, just let me interrupt you, doesn't mean you should interrupt them in those moments, right? It doesn't give you permission. It's not like a magic formula for now it's okay to be rude and interrupt someone. And so for us, we need to focus. We need to be serious about listening to people in our lives. Check out these two proverbs from Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs 18 verse 2, it says, "A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion." Does that sound familiar? It's all of us, right? That we live in a digital age where everyone is posting and everyone is talking, but no one has anything to say. Did you notice that? We live in a world that there's more information, more volumes of information than ever before, but everyone's just expressing opinions. Proverbs 18, verse 13, "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame." It's foolish to speak before we have truly listened. I've once heard it said that God created us with 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we would listen twice as much as we speak. And I think that's a good rule of thumb, that we need to slow down. Not that there's never a time to speak, but we need to slow down before we speak and truly listen. So today we're going to talk about 3 shifts in the way we communicate, 3 shifts in communication. These are our practices. Instead of ending with a list of practices, these are our practices as we're going along today. And each one of these 3 practices come from Pete and Jerry Scazzaro from the Emotionally Healthy Relationships course and workbook. There's a few life groups that are going through that curriculum. We have that curriculum available if your life group would like to continue to grow in these ways as well. Shift number 1, stop mind reading. Can you read someone else's mind? So don't do it. Stop acting like you can. So here's what they mean when they say mind reading. This is assuming things about people, assigning motives to people, filling in the gaps or filling in the blanks and assuming the worst in those situations. So here's just a hypothetical situation. Maybe it's happened to you, maybe it hasn't. You text someone. Imagine you shoot one of your good friends a text message, and whatever you use, you can see that they read it, okay? So they read it at 4:38 p.m. And the text message you sent them was, "Hey, let's go grab dinner tonight. I want to get together for dinner." An hour passes, 2 hour passes, and they don't reply to you. So you start making up all these things in your mind. You're like, I guess I guess I value this friendship more than they do, or you start thinking about, they're probably too busy or whatever, and or maybe you start thinking, I bet they're out with those other friends that they like way better than me, and all this stuff. And then you see them the next day, and instead of telling them, all of these horrible things you've been thinking about them, you just kind of subtly hint at it. You say something like, hey, did you get up to anything interesting last night? And they say, not really. I just kind of hung out at home. I watched a show, went to bed. And then you leave that place and you're like, I knew it. It confirms my suspicions. They don't even care about this, right? They're dead to me. And you start like playing these scenarios out in your mind. That's mind reading. And all of us do it. As humans, it's almost innate in us to fill in the blank, to assign motives. Whether it's an email that someone sent, you send a long, lengthy email to someone, and they reply and they just say, sounds good. You're like, does it really sound good? Because you would have written more than sounds good, right? And it's just, we do this though. We do this. It could be a tone of voice. It could be a way. And we assign motives. We assume the worst, and we read people's minds. The only problem is you can't read someone's mind. You can't do it. And so we need to stop doing these kinds of things. Now, there's no Bible verse that's thou shalt not mind read. But there's one that's pretty close, and it's actually in the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 16 says this, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, some translations kind of, make this a little easier to understand. They just say, no lying. Thou shalt not lie. But in fact, this isn't no lying. This is no bearing false witness. Here's what false witness literally is. It's when you are called to witness about someone's character or their actions in like a trial, in like a formal legal setting, and you accuse them falsely to the point that they're punished for it wrongly. The most famous example of this is Jesus. When the crowd is shouting, crucify him, crucify him. You can read this in the Gospels. It says, many were falsely testifying against Jesus. They're breaking the ninth commandment. They're breaking this commandment. It's to accuse someone to the point that they're wrongly accused, they're wrongly punished, and sometimes even killed because of this. Now, when you look at the way that Jesus interprets the Ten Commandments, and I believe that's the appropriate way for us to interpret the Ten Commandments, is the Ten Commandments are actually a part that represents the whole, if that makes sense. So in Matthew 5, when Jesus is referring to the commandment, don't murder, he's clarifying, now that's not just literally don't murder people. Yes, it's that, but it's also don't have hatred for people. Don't have unforgiveness for people. Don't hurt someone in those kinds of ways. That's a part, the Ten Commandments is a part that actually, the most extreme case is murder, but it's also all those other things on the way to murder. And so for us, the same principle applies to don't bear false witness. So bearing false witness, yes, it's not just if you get called upon in a court of law here, go down to the courthouse and you have to testify about someone, be honest in those, don't lie in a court of law. But it's more than just that. That's the part, that's the most extreme case if you were to lie in that situation, but it represents the whole. This is what Pete and Jerry Scazzaro say. They say, every time we make an assumption about someone who has hurt or disappointed us, without confirming it, this is the key, without confirming it, we believe a lie about this person in our head. Because we have not checked it out with him or her, it is very possible that we are believing something untrue. It is also likely that we will pass that false assumption around to others. So when we do it for other people just in our minds, it's called mind reading, and it can deteriorate the relationship. We are bearing false witness about that person to ourselves in those moments. When we share it, it's something that we call gossip, which just destroys communities as we know it. It's rumors and gossip where we're slandering someone else's character, and now their relationship with that person is in jeopardy because if it's a false assumption that we did not confirm. So what do you do if you're mind reading? Like we've said a million times, stop it. Just don't do that anymore. And so here's what you should do. Instead of talking to that person in your head, which is what we do, we play through the imaginary scenarios. Maybe you're like cussing them out in your head. Like you play through those scenarios. Instead of talking to them in your head, talk to the person in person. It's so simple, and yet we don't do this. It's a simple shift, but we don't do this. Instead of talking to the person in your head, if you find yourself doing that, kind of rehearsing speeches in your head or believing things in your head, instead of talking to them in your head, talk to them in person. I can't tell you the number of situations, conflicts that have been totally resolved by the moment I'm picking up something weird in an email, the moment I'm sensing those things, I just call that person. Say, hey, I just want to clarify, like, I feel like I'm picking up some weird signals from you in this. I feel like you're frustrated in this situation. They're like, oh no, I just didn't have time to really, write out a big response. Great, sounds good. But if we don't do that, then all of a sudden we allow ourselves and the lies we're believing about that other person to be a significant barrier to that relationship, and it ends up destroying those things. So shift number 1, stop mind reading. Shift number 2, clarify expectations. It's been said that at the root of all the anger we experience is unmet expectations. Unmet expectations. Have you ever been angry when you're driving? It's because you didn't expect that person to cut you off without using their signal. You didn't expect the traffic to be as heavy as it was or to hit all the red lights. So here's a quick story about unmet expectations in my life. So early on in my marriage, my wife, Shayna, and I, we had a conflict. Next week, we're talking about conflict, by the way. This week, we're talking about communication. Next week, we're going to talk about when you just aren't getting that communication right. Conflict, next week. Okay. So we were having a conflict, and we were chatting, and often, like we talked about last week, there's things going on beneath the surface. And finally, after what seemed like ages, Shayna finally blurted out, I just want a dog. And I was like, what? We weren't talking about dogs, by the way. We're talking about like our lives and everything. And I was like, you just want a dog? Okay. And so I just shared, well, we live in an apartment right now, and when we get a house, we can get a dog. And it was like, case closed. Praise the Lord. Okay. So a couple years later, we get a house, and it's moving day. So we move into our house, and it's just like exhausting all day work. We have this super heavy washing machine, and we had a second-story apartment, and I was just like ready to throw it over the deck, but we still needed a washer, so we brought it. And I was just like so tired, and it's like the end of the day on Saturday night. I'm teaching, by the way, the next day. So I'm teaching the next day, and I'm not done with my lesson. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, the only two functional pieces of furniture that in our house is the bed and the couch. So I'm sitting on the couch, and everything else is in boxes. Our clothes are in boxes. Our dishes are in boxes. It's like 8:30 p.m., and I'm like typing away, and Shayna walks into the room, and she says, we're getting a puppy. And this was a moment when I was like, what? It's like 8:30. I was like, what? How? When? And she explains, well, I was on Craigslist on my phone, and I called this guy, and he said there's 50 people who wanted the puppy, but I was one of the callers he liked, and so they're going to save us a puppy. It's only an hour and a half away. And I'm like, 8:30 to 10 p.m. to get back at 11, and I'm like doing the math. I'm like, no, we're not getting a puppy. And this was unclear expectations in this moment. And I was like, where did you get the idea that we're getting a puppy? And it was, you said, when we get a house, we can get a puppy. And that's what I said. Her interpretation was, the minute we own a house, we can get a puppy. And my interpretation was, like, no, that's like the next checkpoint is get a house. And then like 6 months down the road, look at a puppy, whatever. So we compromised, and that's how we got our dog Pippin. But that's a case study in unclear expectations. So how do we avoid those kind of situations? We need to clarify our expectations. So here's a list of unfair expectations that we have. Unfair expectation number 1, they're unconscious. We don't even know they're there. You figure out whether you have an expectation that's unconscious when you become disappointed. So allow disappointments or frustration in your life to be a signal for you to say, what was I expecting in this situation? So unconscious. Number 2, is they're unrealistic. That there's just no way that the other person can actually fulfill the expectation that you have for them. They're unrealistic, and so you need to, at those points in time, settle or compromise or figure out more accurate expectations that can be met. Number 3, they're unspoken. You might have a totally realistic expectation for someone, but you have never told them that you expect that of them. A mini example of this is our house is like, you can wear your shoes or not wear your shoes. It doesn't matter. Unless you have really muddy shoes. That's kind of like we don't tell our guests that. And someone was at our house the other week, and they had just gone for a hike, and it was muddy, and I was just like, they kept walking around my house, and I was like, but they don't know that's an expectation. It's realistic, like, hey, I see you have muddy shoes. Could you please take them off and leave them at the door? And I eventually said that because I was preaching on this in a couple weeks. I was like, okay, got to practice it. But just speak those things. I don't know what it is, but there's like a fear in us that we're going to be totally rejected if we just speak those expectations, if they're totally realistic. And then the last one is unagreed upon. You might have an expectation that you're aware of. it might be totally realistic, it's, in your mind at least, and you've spoken it, but if the other person does not agree to it, it's a demand, not an agreement. And so this is very important for marriage. You do not have a list of demands you get to give to the other person. You can agree on things together. And so it has to be agreed upon. So how do we fix these unfair ones? Well, you just take away the first two letters of each word. That expectations, in order to be fair, need to be conscious, need to be aware of them. The more that you can assess your disappointment and assess your frustration, the more you will be aware of these expectations. They need to be realistic. You need to allow someone else to have the room to say, you asked me to do X, Y, and Z. I can only do X and Y. You're on your own with Z. I don't know, I can't do that much for you in this situation or this relationship. They need to be spoken. And when we speak these, we need to speak these things with grace and love. And then the last one is they need to be agreed upon. It's not valid unless it's agreed upon. Here's the statement. Here's a great quote from Pete and Jerry Scazzaro. They say, an expectation is only valid when it is realistic and mutually agreed upon. When it's realistic and mutually agreed upon. By the way, if it's mutually agreed upon, even if you both agree to an expectation, but it's not realistic, then it's a hope and a dream. It's not an agreement. It's not a clear or real expectation for your life. There's a lot of conflict that can be avoided if we just stopped mind reading and started clarifying our expectations. The more that you can clarify expectations ahead of time, the healthier your relationships will be. But even when you aren't able to do that ahead of time, when there's breakdowns in communication, go back to the drawing board and say, what unmet expectations am I experiencing? And re-clarify those things again. Understanding that it's not valid if the other person didn't mutually agree upon it. Communication shift number 3 is a skill called incarnational listening. The word incarnational is a theological word. It's a churchy word. It literally means in flesh. And it's what Jesus has done for us. The Son became flesh. He took on flesh and dwelt among us. This is what the angel Gabriel prophesied about Jesus when he said he shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. And so this is the process of entering into someone else's world and engaging in relationship with him. This is what Jesus has done for us. This is what Pete and Jerry Scazzaro say about it. They say, incarnational listening, this is how they define it, to listen at a heart level with empathy, attuned to the words and nonverbal communication of another person so that the other person feels felt by you. Now, sometimes we say, no, I understood you. Do they feel like you understood them? Do they feel felt by you? Have you ever heard people say, you feel me? Do you feel me? That's what they're looking for. They're looking for confirmation that you not only literally heard the word, like that's what we think, I understood you, I heard the words. No. Do you feel what I'm feeling? Are you entering into my world and set aside your own agenda, your own response, and are you just simply listening and engaging in relationship with me? So here's before we get to that, Proverbs 20 verse 5 says this, the purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Last week, if you missed it, highly recommend, we looked at the things beneath the surface. Every single human, it's like the iceberg principle. There's 10% on top. It's what everyone sees. There's 90%. Most of what a person is beneath the surface. That's what this proverb is saying. Now, the reality is, if you're to incarnationally listen to someone, you will be able to draw out those things that are beneath the surface. So that's not just important as a self-awareness, self-reflection thing for you to do on your own, but in your relationships, to listen incarnationally means to draw out the deep wells of water that are underneath the surface in people's souls. So here's 7 tips for how to do this. 7 steps for incarnational listening. Number 1, give your full attention. Turn your phone on Do Not Disturb. Put away distractions. Don't try and have a serious conversation while you're also cooking dinner. Sit down, make eye contact, remove distractions, go for a drive if you need to, and just give your full attention to the other person. Number 2 is step into the speaker's world. This is what we call empathizing with someone. Step into their shoes. Before you say, well, this is what I would do if I was in your shoes, just step into their shoes and try and actually feel what they're feeling. A good way to do this is not just paying attention to the words they're saying, but also to their nonverbal communication, as Pete and Jerry Scazzaro say. Look into their eyes. Look at their body language. Try and hear the tone of voice and identify what that person's feeling. And try and actually Weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice, as Paul writes in Romans. That this is something God calls us to do for one another as we bear one another's burdens. Number 3, avoid judging, interpreting, and fixing. Now, judging, we know. Look at the log in your own eye before you take the speck out of someone else's eye. Interpreting is just assuming you know what they mean without actually checking. But fixing is one that well-intentioned Christians always do. It's, I hear what you're saying. You need to listen to this podcast. It'll take care of that problem in no time. You need to read this book that I read. That'll be the thing. Or we kind of write off these deep problems that people are wrestling with these really short answers, like we are the expert in solving their problems. And often what people need is they just need to be listened to. So avoid interpreting, avoid judging, and avoid fixing. Number 4 is label the emotions that you hear. It's helpful to just identify. You can help someone else do emotional processing by labeling the emotion that you're hearing from them. Now, there's a healthy way to do this, unhealthy way. The unhealthy way is you're mad about this and telling them what they're feeling. Don't tell them what they're feeling. The healthy way to do it is ask or check by just saying, you sound angry. I'm sensing that you're angry. What I'm feeling from you is I'm feeling anger from you right now in this moment. And in those moments, the person will either be able to verify, yes, I am feeling angry, and they'll be able to help process through that, or that won't be what they're feeling at all. I can't tell you, we do this with our toddler right now, with my daughter Lily at home. I can't tell you the number of times where she's throwing a tantrum, and I just slow down, and I say, Lily, you sound mad. And sometimes she is mad. She's like, yeah, and she continues to throw a tantrum. Like, okay, well, at least we're on the same page. You're mad. Sometimes, this is mind-blowing, she'll stop, think about, am I mad? And she'll say, no, I'm happy, and she'll just start playing again. That's powerful emotional processing right there. Because sometimes the way that people are talking or speaking, it's not actually what they're feeling, and you just simply labeling, I'm sensing, this is what I'm hearing from you, is a way for you to help them move past maybe what's going on in that 10% and actually get to the 90% that's beneath the surface. Number 5 is check if you've heard correctly. Check that you've heard correctly. This is how you avoid interpreting or misinterpreting what someone is saying. Just repeat back to them, here's what I'm hearing you say, and just try and as concisely as possible reiterate what you're hearing from them. Oftentimes, if you do that, the person will say, no, that's not it, and they'll say a few more things. You can do that again. Okay, so let me check again if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, and just check, because you need to allow the other person to determine what they're saying, not you mind read, tell them what they're saying, fix their problem, boom, you leave, you feel really good, and they feel like you're a horrible friend, okay? So that's check if you've heard correctly. Number 6, you just ask, if you sense that there's more, can you tell me more about that? Maybe there's a word that person used. Can you tell me more about this? Or is that, you can even just ask simply, if you're not, just, is there more? Is there anything else? Is there more? And often, what people are doing in those deep conversations, the relational kinds of conversations that they're having with us, is they're testing the waters with the first thing they share with you. And if you're doing a good job listening to them, this is how in Proverbs 20, verse 5, you can draw the deep well of that water out from someone, is just to ask them if there's more. If they realize you're a safe person, again, being heard is almost identical to being loved, then they'll say, actually, there is more. And they'll share something deeper, and they'll share something deeper. And this is one of the best ways for us to love your neighbor as yourself, by genuinely hearing someone. And then number 7, repeat until the other person feels heard. Not until you think you've heard them. Repeat until they really feel heard. You can even just say, do you feel like I hear you? Or do you feel like I get what you're saying? And wait for confirmation that they do. Now, one of the automatic pushbacks is, man, isn't that a lot of work? To go through those steps, and then even if I go through them, to repeat them if I haven't gotten to, yes, loving other people is a ton of work. Watching 3 hours of YouTube to learn sign language, yeah, that's work. And yet, again, I cannot overemphasize the stakes, what's at stake in this. This is marriages. This is parenting. This is friendships. This is work relationships. This is reaching the lost in this world. This is our life together as the family of God, and we have to be willing to do the work. Jesus said following him is a lot like taking up your cross, denying yourself, and following him. And for us, Sometimes what that means is it means leaving your agenda at the door when you sit down with someone and just seek to listen to them. And the beautiful thing about the God that we follow is he's a God who does this for us. Remember, like Bonhoeffer says, he lends us his ear. Are you familiar with the story of Abraham and Hagar from the Old Testament? This is early in the Old Testament, in the middle of the book of Genesis. If you're not familiar, let me set up the scene for you. Christians often don't talk about this because this is like one of the dark spots for Abraham. He's like the father of the Judeo-Christian faith. Father Abraham had many sons, if you know the song. And God had made this promise to Abraham that he was going to have descendants, offspring, as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that God would bless his family line, and that family would be a blessing to the rest of the world. This is a covenant that God made with Abraham. Well, fast forward, Abraham is 85 years old, still 0 kids. It's like, how am I supposed to have offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky? I don't even have one. I don't even have one child. And so this is the moment where Abraham and his wife Sarah says to Abraham, I've got an idea. Maybe God meant that, you're supposed to take matters into your own hands. Why don't you sleep with my servant, my Egyptian servant, Hagar, and then that can be the child, and that can be, where the family line starts. That wasn't, by the way, the promise that God made. The promise that God made was that Abraham and Sarah would have children, but this is just a moment, kind of a lapse in faith. And so Abraham says, sure. So sure enough, he has a child. He conceives a child with Hagar. And almost the moment that Hagar gets pregnant, all of a sudden, what was such a bright idea by Sarah, she regrets it. And she has bitterness and jealousy towards the servant of hers that is now carrying, the child of her husband. And she starts to mistreat her and abuse her, maybe verbally, we're not sure exactly. But it gets so severe that Hagar, who's like an innocent bystander in this, right? She's a slave, so she's like at the mercy of her masters, is enduring this persecution for something that her master, Sarah, told her to do anyways, right? It's so severe that she runs away. You got to imagine, these are nomadic people who live in the desert. So Hagar has no idea where she's going, and she will likely die if she just keeps running away in the desert by herself. And she thinks that is better than staying where she was. And so Hagar is on the run, and she finds this oasis in the middle of the desert, and she's at this spring of water, and she's drinking, and this is maybe the lowest moment in Hagar's life. She's been abused. She's probably got bitterness and frustration and anxiety about her future. And God sends the angel of the Lord to meet Hagar in this moment. This is a beautiful moment. And the angel of the Lord says, where are you coming from, and where are you going? Now, Hagar knows exactly where she's coming from. She's coming from this really dark place. But she has no idea where she's going. And in this moment, this is what the angel of the Lord says to her. I want to read to you these words. Genesis chapter 16, verse 11. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Now, if we can just get past the wild donkey of a man statement, it's a prophecy about the kind of person that Ishmael will become and his family line and all this sort of stuff. And just look at this beautiful moment. There's 2 names that are given. God gives Hagar's son a name, and Hagar gives God a name. We don't get this culturally. We're like, fun name. What did you name your child? That's great. There's a ton of significance. It's almost like your destiny, your identity is wrapped up in your name, in this ancient culture. And so the name that God tells Hagar to give her son is Ishmael, literally means God hears me. God hears me. In this moment of deep trial and trouble, this slave girl who has been abused and mistreated, who has no idea where she's going, maybe you feel like that in your life. I want you to hear this. God hears you. God is lending you his ear. And then Hagar turns around and she names God. The audacity, by the way, to give God a name. She says, I'm going to call you the God who sees, because you have seen me in my affliction. And I just want you to know that. That's the God that we serve. We serve and we believe in a God who hears you and he sees you and he truly knows you. The ultimate way that we experience this is in the person of Jesus Christ. In John 1:14, the Apostle John writes this, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." That's the incarnation that John is talking about. John uses this word logos. It's the word, the Greek word, and it's really loaded with meaning. We don't have time to go quite into the meaning, but in Greek philosophy, it's similar to how people today would say the universe meant for this to happen or whatever. It's kind of like the reason or logic behind the whole universe. That's how Greek philosophers, not the same, but similar to how Greek philosophers talked about the logos, the fabric of the universe. What John is saying is, that's Jesus, by the way. You can know him. It's not just this unknowing force throughout the universe. That's Jesus. But also the fact that he uses the word. That's a communication term. That God has sent us a message in the form of his Son, Jesus. The most personal message that we could ever receive. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. As Eugene Peterson says, moved into the neighborhood. And he entered into our world. And he took on flesh and he lived a perfect life. Ultimately, he died for our sake in our place and suffered on the cross for the forgiveness of sins so that you and I could be made right with God. And he raised 3 days later so that we could be raised to life as well. And that's the beautiful good news of the gospel, that we have a God who is willing to do that for you. And if we've experienced that good news and that relationship from the gospel, as followers of Jesus, we must be willing to focus more on hearing others than being heard ourselves.